we're talking about a situation as difficult as it is to conceive where we have to consider how to retaliate for a Chinese conventional precision strike on our forces and bases. That's the question. What would we do if that were to happen? Part of the answer, it seems to me, has to be that we would carry out some conventional strikes of our own against Chinese military targets on the Chinese mainland.
What is the risk of attacking mainland China? The risk is that the Chinese would attack mainland United States.
Frankly speaking, I think it's a nutty idea. You will hear a lot of Americans talk about Airsea Battle.
Airsea Battle is an innovative concept that the Navy and the Air Force developed about 4 years ago in the United States with the help of another think tank. And the idea was, in a way, it was the military equivalent of the Asia-Pacific rebalance.
Which is the idea that if the Chinese mainland projects its power in ways offshore that we don't like, we would attack the mainland in the rear areas to weaken their capacity to continue to threaten offshore areas in East Asia.
Airsea Battle is a concept that initially started with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, and it was their effort to determine a way to defeat China's growing anti-access aerial denial. The shorthand for that is A2AD. And that is a concept where China feels the way to protect its shore is to create a system of air, sea, and land-based defenses that will force the U.S. fleet to stay 1,000 miles from China's shore. Obviously, that means we can't get in to help our allies in the area.
Airsea Battle essentially is attempting to protect American freedom of action in Pacific Asia by holding at risk key Chinese capabilities, particularly with respect to ISR, that happen to be located on the Chinese mainland.
The problem, of course, is it's a very aggressive concept. It involves 3 phases: blind the Chinese command and control system, knock out the command and control system, and then knock out the individual missiles.
By attacking these capabilities early in the war, it essentially creates a freedom for the United States to be able to move its warfighting capabilities closer to the Chinese coast, which is where all America's allies happen to be located. This in turn raises the question of whether even conventional attacks on the Chinese coast do not open the door to potential Chinese nuclear retaliation.
Airsea Battle, per se, within the Pentagon, does not necessarily require you to strike the Chinese homeland early. However, the logic of Airsea Battle and some of the papers written by the think tank that helped develop it do talk about early offensive action against the Chinese homeland, specifically ballistic missile launchers, airfields, submarine ports, and other such assets, space assets, that would be involved in these early Chinese strikes against our aircraft carriers at sea, our bases in places like Okinawa. And so the whole logic of what the Chinese are doing and what we're doing in response does push both sides towards early, strong, preemptive action against the other.
Frankly speaking, I think it's a nutty idea. Because you have to then ask, what's the next move? What do we think China does after we've struck their homeland? After all, they'll be operating in this scene offshore, and our escalatory move under this scenario is going to be onshore, hitting Chinese assets, and I don't think you can hypothesize that the Chinese won't retaliate.
What is the risk of attacking mainland China? The risk is that the Chinese would attack mainland United States.
And you have to therefore ask, how will they retaliate? And almost all of the ways, whether it's against Japan or our forces in Guam or Taiwan or whatever your scenario is going to be highly escalatory.
One reason, of course, is they perceive this gap. It'll be a number of years before we can actually do Airsea Battle. So if there's going to be a conflict, we should do it then. That's an escalatory pressure. But the real escalatory pressure is that Airsea Battle relies heavily on space and cyber assets. And what we know about space and cyber is they're offense dominated now. The first person who attacks in space gets a great advantage. The first person who attacks in cyber gets a great advantage. So in a period of crisis, the politicians may be trying to lean back. The diplomats are trying to lean back. And if the president comes to the Joint Chiefs and says, when do I need to strike China? They would have to say, yesterday would have been better, because we don't know what they're doing. And they may strike first in cyber and we could be crippled. And we won't be able to execute any strategy based on striking into China. So this is one of the big dangers of Airsea Battle, is it's escalatory. And personally, as a strategist, in a crisis between thermonuclear powers, I want a reason to be leaning back, not a reason to be leaning in, because the results can be so devastating.
What if the worst case scenario happens? Let's say a Chinese ballistic missile takes out a U.S. aircraft carrier. Well, on the U.S. side, the question is, if we see that China has that capability, and if the circumstances suggest a possibility that an aircraft carrier could be taken out, then the sensible thing to do would be to take out that capability. But the capability rests on the Chinese mainland. And if you attack the Chinese mainland, you have an escalation control problem.
It is true that certain components of Airsea Battle may be highly escalatory, especially deep strikes against Chinese command and control systems, as well as Chinese conventional missile systems. And of course, that raises a whole host of issues about escalation, because we would be talking about conducting deep strikes against a great power that also has nuclear weapons.
So unfortunately, when you're dealing with an opponent as big as China, you just can't run up the escalatory ladder, because with China, it ends with nuclear weapons, that escalatory ladder.
China perceives us as aggressive. We are trying to isolate China. They're adamant about that. Almost every PLA guy you talk to is, you guys are trying to isolate us. It's all about you trying to humiliate us. You're trying to hold China down. Our response is, you're trying to expand too fast. So there's a great deal of misunderstanding here. This is why it's more important than ever that any strategy, military strategy, be de-escalatory. You don't want to lean forward into a fight, because it's going to be a misunderstanding, I think. If there's a fight between China and the United States, it'll be based primarily on a misunderstanding that will roll and get out of control. And then passion in the Trinity takes over, and you can't get it back under control. And then that's really a disaster for the world.
This is why you don't want to get a conflict with China, because it gives you nothing but bad choices.
The logic of the concepts could incentivize American or Chinese officers to intend to strike the other side fast and early while they still can. And that's the danger that we see looming.
Further complicating this issue is that many of the targets that we might be hitting would have a nuclear component to it. The key concern here is that some of those command and control infrastructure and system, as well as China's Second Artillery Force units, are dual use. In other words, they are both conventional and nuclear in nature. In other words, from the Chinese perspective, if we began to conduct these conventional precision strikes against that command and control infrastructure, they would have a hard time telling whether it was a conventional attack or whether it was a conventional disarming attack against China's nuclear capabilities. And that might mean that China would face a potential use it or lose it scenario that would then lead to nuclear escalation.
One of the sets of ideas associated with that is early offensive action to preempt or otherwise destroy the kinds of enemy assets that could be used against your ships and airfields. So instead of trying to shoot down their ballistic missiles once they're coming your way, you try to nail them on the launch pad. There's a very good military logic to that, but there's an escalatory strategic circumstance that goes along with it. And if both sides are aiming and getting ready to strike hard early at the first sign of conflict with the other, you've got some of the same dynamics now cooked into the system that we saw make Europe of 1914 so dangerous.
So I think if you take that first step, you're not going to be able to control the run up the escalatory ladder. So it's a militarily dangerous idea. And it feeds the most paranoid Chinese understanding of our strategy.
So our argument is, be careful how you handle these concepts. They may have a certain military logic to you, but they could actually be very destabilizing in a crisis, just like the Schlieffen Plan in Germany in 1914 led the Germans to feel like they needed to go all or nothing very early, and that kind of logic led to the outbreak of World War I.
If we're aggressive and we talk a lot about Airsea Battle and we're going to take out Chinese missiles and go inside China and at dawn at 6 a.m., our worst case outcome, we won't have the money to do that. And they will do it because we will have confirmed the Chinese conservatives' nightmare. They will get the upper hand at the top leadership meetings in China, and they will say the Americans are coming for us. We need this money.
Again, the point is not to fight that kind of war, but to deter it. And part of the way in which you deter it is by forcing a Chinese military planner to say, what would the Americans do if we carried out these strikes? If they can convince themselves that we either would be unwilling or unable to retaliate in a meaningful way, the danger that they would try to do that goes up. If, when they look at the balance of forces, they conclude that if they were to carry out that kind of attack, we would strike back against them in ways that would be damaging to their military capabilities, it seems to me less likely that they would ever go down that road.
Now, how China actually responds in such a situation is really impossible to predict with any confidence today. Much will depend on the political circumstances surrounding the conflict. Much will depend on the stakes as Chinese leaders see those stakes. And much will depend on the extent of the damage or the devastation caused by American attacks on the Chinese homeland. It is possible that some of these attacks will be relatively discreet, they will be relatively focused, and aimed at paralyzing Chinese response capabilities rather than exacting an extremely high human toll. And if that is the case, if we are lucky, China may choose not to respond through any sort of nuclear instruments. On the other hand, China could do just the opposite and at least threaten the use of nuclear weapons, if not actually using them. And then the question becomes, if China reaches that point, is American deterrence, the fact that both sides have secure second strike capabilities, is that adequate enough? And honestly, no one can tell you whether those capabilities would be adequate or not, because deterrence is in many ways a mystical product. We don't know what contributes to it. We just hope that anyone threatening to use nuclear weapons would be cautioned by the fact that the use of nuclear weapons invites comparable retaliation. And that puts both sides in a very untenable position before long.
Part of China's anti-access strategy, if you look at their force structure, is that many of the missiles and many of the capabilities are shore-based. In other words, they're based on the Chinese mainland. Whether it's the missiles that are attached to the aircraft, they have to take off from airfields on the mainland. Whether it's the anti-ship ballistic missile, there are trucks that are running along the coast of China, for example, or maybe further inland in China, as well as a whole host of capabilities that would be launched directly from the mainland. What that means, in my view, is that the Chinese are essentially daring the United States, because the Chinese know that no president in the White House would ever willy-nilly make a decision to conduct deep strikes against those targets, against the Chinese mainland, against a great power that has nuclear weapons. And that is precisely the political, strategic dilemma that the Chinese are hoping to impose on the Americans.
The American people have a lot of domestic priorities, and all those domestic priorities are going out the window if we end up moving up that kind of escalatory ladder. So our presidents are going to decide on a political basis, not just what is the optimal military policy from the viewpoint of a warfighter.
Now, if we look at the historical examples, we recognize that there were strong military reasons for attacking bases in Manchuria that were supporting the war effort against us in Korea. But General MacArthur could never get permission from Washington to engage in such activities.
And President Truman made the decision to get in a full war with the Chinese was not something we were either capable of or the American people would support. And so we had to fight a limited war.
At the operational level, it would be most efficacious for the United States to get rid of those threats on the mainland. But at the strategic political level, it is extraordinarily vexing because, again, no decision maker would ever give the green light to directly attacking military targets against the mainland on China. And again, this goes back to this familiar axiom, right? Never fight a land war in Asia. The Chinese are essentially posing that question to the United States. Are you prepared, essentially, to horizontally escalate this war onto the Chinese mainland?
The same problem occurred in the Vietnam War, where China was actively supporting our enemies in the Vietnam War, and yet we never undertook strikes against the China mainland because of the risk of geographic expansion of the scope of the war.
Vietnam, we had the same unhappy experience. China was supplying the North Vietnamese, but we never, at least intentionally, attacked Chinese territory in the People's Republic of China.
So Airsea Battle proposes strikes on the Chinese mainland. Now, in this case, China would presumably be the enemy. But the question still is, how do you manage escalation under these questions?
We are not going to initiate a war by attacking China. If China initiates a conflict by attacking our forces and bases or our allies, whom we're sworn to defend, I don't think we can afford to allow them a sanctuary or to let them believe that they would have a sanctuary from which they could continue to carry out those kinds of attacks.
This whole question of deterrence, in order to forestall an action, you have to threaten the assets that China, in this case it's missiles inland, you have to be able to take them out if you want to deter the Chinese from using them in the first place. I understand that logic, and there's some logic to it.
What kind of signal would we be sending to the Chinese if we simply said, yes, you can attack our forward military bases, you can attack our bases on Allied soil, you have the right to attack our allies and our Allied bases, and your targets on the mainland are essentially off limits? I'm not sure that that's the kind of signal that we should be sending to the Chinese. It doesn't mean that deep strikes against the mainland will be automatic, but we need to at least preserve the option to maintain that level of strategic ambiguity so that there is at least some doubt in the minds of the Chinese as to whether we would employ that option or not. And the more ambiguity, the more caution that we can impose on the Chinese, in my view, the more sturdy deterrence will be.
Of course, the problem with Airsea Battle is what happens if deterrence fails and China actually attacks American ships and forward bases. The answer may well lie within a battle plan known within Pentagon circles as Offshore Control.
One of the differences between Airsea Battle and Offshore Control is where it guides your investment portfolio. You have to have a strategy that fits inside the budget you have, or you don't have a strategy. We want a strategy that works today with the material we have today and that we can openly demonstrate.
Offshore Control essentially says, well, China's a nuclear armed power. Let's not talk about striking the Chinese continent. Let's stay away and just blockade and strangulate China.
Proponents of offshore control base that upon the understanding that Airsea Battle would possibly provoke a nuclear response, and that a more effective way of manipulating the cost-benefit calculations of the Chinese Communist Party leadership is through interdiction, for example, trade that comes in and out of China.
Offshore control is based on the concept that striking into China is a bad idea, that we don't have the money to do that, and that it's dangerous. So instead, how do you defeat China? You attack their strategic center of gravity, which is their economy. That's also the political center of gravity of China, is the economy, because the only legitimacy of the Communist Party is the promise of continued growth. So it's based on three concepts. Deny China the use of the East and South China Sea. Defend the first island chain and be dominant outside the first island chain. Now what that does is immediately cut off, or at whatever pace we choose to make it, cut off the possibility of Chinese exporting.
Depriving China of its naval capabilities which we're currently able to do, would have profound effects on their economy, and I think would shorten a war which, in other circumstances, could be a long and an extended one.
The vast majority of their energy resources come from overseas through Malacca, and their economy is reliant on foreign trade, which must go out by sea. So whereas Airsea Battle attacks tactical targets, which the Chinese are pretty confident they can protect, Offshore Control attacks a strategic target, which they have stated they know they can't protect. Which do you think would be more deterrent?
What we're talking about here in terms of objectives is constraining, limiting, sealing off Chinese commercial traffic.
Now, we won't be able to intercept all the ships. Some will get through. But China's economic advantage now is based on the very large ships, post-Panamax, more than 5,000 containers. The new Triple E class is 18,000 containers per ship. Those we can easily round up. There are fewer than 1,000 of them in the world. The other question of then the smaller ships will get through, yes, they will, but you won't be economically competitive. You'll barely be able to feed yourself. This is, again, one of China's problems because they've damaged so much of their own land, they actually cannot feed themselves. So they need major food imports. They'll cut back, obviously, on chicken and pig and go back to eating grain, so that'll reduce it.
And here's what Colonel Hams thinks ultimately may be the greatest advantage of offshore control.
It takes place slowly, it can be adjusted, and it allows the Communist Party the out that it's used in the 4 wars that they fought. The Korean War, the war with India, the Xinbao Island incident between Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, and the Vietnam War. In each case, regardless of the results on the battlefield, they declared victory and declared the war over. That's the out you want to provide them the opportunity to declare victory.
But of course, like Airsea Battle, offshore control is not without its critics or shortage of problems. And even Colonel Hams admits that.
No strategy is perfect. Offshore control has problems. But any strategy for conflict with China will have problems. All you can do is say, is it a better strategy or a worse strategy than this other one?
There are a number of substantial criticisms or critiques of the blockade strategy. One is that it might not be an adequate deterrent. So the idea that the United States and perhaps its allies were going to impose some kind of economic blockade on China might not be sufficient to deter China's leaders from using force, for example, if they felt that they needed to in order to prevent Taiwan from becoming independent.
Another piece of this is whether or not we should expect most of the world to join us in a blockade.
A problem you have in dealing with the allies out there is that their number one trading party for all of them is China.
It's awfully hard to maintain a blockade if China, at this point the largest trading country in the world, is able to waive currency and trade benefits and things with people that we want to stop trading with China.
The costs that would be imposed by a blockade strategy are long-term, and China's leaders might not believe that the United States had the necessary resolve to maintain a blockade, that the economic costs for the U.S. of disrupting global trade would be so great that the U.S. would be under pressure to pull back, that a number of U.S. allies and partners who would have to cooperate in some way with a blockade would fail to do so because their own economic interests might push them not to.
There are some studies that say, you know, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough ships. If we intercept at the straits and then let them go, oh my God, they'll just resell.
There are numerous logistical problems. One is that you would need to distinguish between tankers that were headed for China and those that were going to other countries, including U.S. allies. Second is that there might be a secondary market, so oil that was in a tanker that was supposedly headed for Indonesia might eventually be bought by a company that was going to send it to China.
For instance, as you pass through the Malacca Strait, you're intercepted, I inspect. Nothing's due to go to China, it's all going to the Philippines. You sail in the South China Sea, you resell it to China.
So how exactly you would do that is not so clear.
Well, suppose I put 10 Marines on your ship. They got a GPS. It looks like you're going to China. You've just declared a war prize. And I take you to a holding area, and we turn you over to prize court. And again, I've only got to get about 800 or 900 of these ships. So that would be a grand total of 9,000 Marines. Well, we've got a 400,000 man Army and a 180,000 man Marine Corps at this point. That gives us plenty of people to babysit ships.
One of the issues that the offshore control folks don't address is time frame. Blockades take an awfully long time.
If you go, as some have suggested, to blockade and strangulation tactics, well, first of all, that takes a long time. China's 20% of the world's people, a huge continent, so to think about a strategy of strangling that is a long-term, major commitment.
The question of how long will offshore control take to work, that will depend upon the Communist Party decision-making. If they decide to stick it out, it will be a long war, 4 or 5 years.
Blockades also have a mixed record in their impact on the outcome of wars. It's true that the Allied powers imposed a blockade on Germany during the First World War, that the United States imposed a blockade on Japan during World War II, and that those had significant economic impact on the economies of those countries. But they only did so over a long period of time and in conjunction with a variety of other kinds of military operations. In the case of Japan, the bombing of the home islands by the United States. In the case of Germany in the First World War, 4 years of trench warfare on the Western Front also contributed eventually to Germany's defeat. So blockades may be effective, but their effect may only come in the long run.
But in any case, if China decides to fight, even if we bomb, it'll take 4 or 5 years at a minimum. Anybody who thinks there's a short war between continental-sized states hasn't studied history for the last couple hundred years.
And you'd have to ask yourself, as important as China is to the global economy, what shape is the global economy going to be in after we've gone down this road? And the answer is it's going to be a disaster.
There are lots of people in the world who are more than happy to make what China's making. So remember, at the same time that we're shutting down China's economy, the global economy collapses. That's a given, any war between China and the United States. The question is, how fast can you make it recover?
You can't even look at a financial page in American newspapers without seeing 4 or 5 stories on how central China is to the world growth engine. It buys U.S. bonds and treasury notes. It's investing. It's the most rapidly growing investor in the United States. What's going to happen to that whole economic relationship with this?
Well, if we're blockading and we're preserving the resources of the big ships, then other people that want to make this stuff, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, whomever wants to manufacture, is free to, and will continue to trade globally. Because if you look at a map, South and East China Sea are very, very small plots on the global trade network. And there are bypasses for everybody except China and Vietnam. And China will see the global economy recovering, and will see the contracts that used to come to Chinese companies going elsewhere, and know it'll be very difficult to get back. So they may choose to terminate this thing fairly early.
I think that there's a tendency in Washington to create straw men out of other people's arguments, and so you have the seemingly diametrically opposed arguments over the value and the validity of Airsea Battle. And I think the reality is always sort of somewhere in between.
Any imaginable conflict, these are not fun things to think about, but we have to think about them, but any imaginable conflict with China would require elements of both. You can't see just relying on a naval blockade. China's used to taking a lot of economic pain through its history. You need one, certainly, because you want to be able to escalate the conflict and control it in ways that times and ways of your own choosing. So you certainly want to use economic strangulation as a tool. But I think if China started hitting our allies in other countries or our own bases, we would want to put a stop to that. And I think you would have to go and go after forces in China. And it goes exactly back to why we need to be having these serious, hard-headed military conversations with China about things like nuclear thresholds and nuclear plans and posture and signals from us, and how would they know if we're hitting them conventionally or with nuclear power and so on. And we're so far from that that's very scary. We need to be adult about this and realize we're in a military competition with China. It's not the defining characteristic of our relationship with China. Our relationship is multifaceted, but we both need to be candid and adult about the fact that we are in a military competition, and we want to manage that competition so that we don't have to be asking these questions about nuclear thresholds in the first place.
If you look at the alternative strategies, Airsea Battle, various forms of blockade, I don't think we're going to wind up with a pure version of any one of these alternatives. We're going to wind up with some combination of elements that have been advocated for each. So my own view is that we get some deterrent benefit out of maintaining the capacity to threaten a blockade against China in the event of conflict. China's leaders are obviously very concerned about that, as well they should be, and that can serve a useful deterrent purpose. I don't think there's much controversy about the need to reduce the vulnerability of our forces and bases in the region. The biggest controversy has to do with whether and to what extent we should develop offensive, conventional precision strike capabilities that are targeted against the Chinese mainland. The fact is that we have those now. We don't have an enormous number of systems that can carry out those kinds of strikes, and moreover, the ranges of those systems are not sufficient to cover targets throughout China. So the question is, should we be investing more in long-range conventional precision strike? How much of a capacity should we try to build? How much of that part of the Airsea Battle package should we invest in?
This is the other problem I have with Airsea Battle. Extraordinarily expensive. We need a B-3 bomber. How many billions of dollars is that? We have to have all the F-35s. We need new carrier battle groups. We need new this and new that. Whereas with offshore control, we can do it with the resources we have today with very minor investments in how to restore connectivity when inevitable cyber attacks. We should have that anyhow. That's something we need for day to day.
I think that we need to develop more of a capability to carry out, I would say, limited but significant long-range conventional precision strike attacks on China, including on its the elements of its own anti-access area denial capabilities, particularly command control, communications, surveillance systems that would allow those weapons to be used against us. We're talking about a situation as difficult as it is to conceive, where we have to consider how to retaliate for a Chinese conventional precision strike on our forces and bases. That's the question. What would we do if that were to happen? Part of the answer, it seems to me, has to be that we would carry out some conventional strikes of our own against Chinese military targets on the Chinese mainland. Again, the point is not to fight that kind of war, but to deter it. And part of the way in which you deter it is by forcing a Chinese military planner to say, what would the Americans do if we carried out these strikes? If they can convince themselves that we either would be unwilling or unable to retaliate in a meaningful way, the danger that they would try to do that goes up. If, when they look at the balance of forces, they conclude that if they were to carry out that kind of attack, we would strike back against them in ways that would be damaging to their military capabilities, it seems to me less likely that they would ever go down that road.
Well, at this point, it should be clear that there exists a very real risk that China might attack American ships and forward bases in Asia. It should be equally clear that neither Airsea Battle nor Offshore Control are foolproof strategic responses, at least not without risking everything from a global economic collapse to a nuclear holocaust. But there is also the larger question: what would happen if Chinese and U.S. forces actually engaged? At least one answer may be found in an old axiom first popularized by Joseph Stalin.
I'm not one of those who is persuaded that Chinese military capability will exceed American capability anytime in the first half of this century.
We may have much more sophisticated weapons. Each individual platform may be superior to its Chinese counterpart, but we don't have that many of them, in part because they're very expensive. We also don't necessarily have that many that we could deploy to the region because we're a global power, whereas China is a regional power.
For example, with an F-22, it has a very high ceiling, it flies high, it flies very fast, and it has a low radar cross-section. So it's hard to pick up. But one day they'll get better. They'll have a radar that looks higher, that can track faster objects, and is more sensitive. And that day, they may not be able to see the F-22 right away, but they'll see it sooner than they can see it today. That affects everything, which is one reason you still need numbers. And as the military says, quantity is a quality of its own. If you only got 2 of these great planes, no one's particularly scared of you. If you can darken the skies of an adversary, like we did in World War II with an armada in the air, that's credible. Unfortunately, that's not what we're doing, and it's not what we're going to do.
I think there is an argument about the shrinking size of the U.S. fleet, and that argument is that each surface combatant and each weapons system now far more capable than the individual system even, say, 10, 15 years ago. And so the argument there is that quality will make up for the decline in quantity. But I would go back to the dictum that quantity has a quality all its own. And that's because, of course, a sunk ship is a sunk ship. The reality is you'll have fewer assets that you'll be able to use in theater.
And so even if China's systems are not as sophisticated as those of the United States, the numbers that they can deploy, their willingness perhaps to take losses, which might be greater than our own, poses a strategic challenge. But it's also true that the technical sophistication of Chinese systems is moving forward very rapidly.
The Chinese have made an inordinate effort in the last 20 years to buy top-of-the-line Russian equipment.
China has both procured Soviet-era missiles, which used to keep us up nights when I was in uniform, and which, as far as I can tell, have lost a little of their potency.
They have reversed engineered many of the airplanes and the missilery that they've acquired from Russia. And in some cases, the reverse engineered products are actually even better than the original. And so you now have a very sophisticated Chinese Air Force with both in terms of numbers and potentially in quality.
So being able to not only to steal, but also then to copy and develop military systems and to improve them is enabling China to move up the ladder in terms of the technological sophistication.
It's true. China has probably the world's biggest effort underway to steal intellectual property of all sorts, including military technology. So we'll stipulate that. But on the other hand, China is dumping and doubling the percentage of its GDP that it's putting into research and development. Its university enrollments are up 8 times over 1990. It's investing in human resources. It's sending 235,000 of its best students in tertiary education to the United States. China's investing in education, innovation, and so forth.
I mean, we just think we're so big and we're so sophisticated and we're so technologically advanced that whatever we build is going to beat the other guy. And they've been robbing us blind and robbing the American taxpayer blind of billions of dollars of development and research money for decades. And not one of us raises a peep about it, including the President of the United States.
So the days of us looking at them condescendingly like million-man swim,
Right.
Those are over.
I think that was a huge mistake. And there are still people who will say things like that.
We are still the most effective and will be for the next couple decades the most effective military power in that region.
It's a mistake for at least for 2 reasons. One, you don't compare military systems necessarily head to head. You ask what might be used against the systems that we have. So our aircraft carriers are vastly superior to the 1 or 2 aircraft carriers they have, but suppose that the Chinese are attempting to sink an aircraft carrier with a very inexpensive missile, which is what they've concentrated on doing. That head-to-head comparison between our aircraft carriers and theirs is not the relevant one. That's number one.
The old way of thinking used to be American technology is by far the world's best. Our ships our fighter aircraft, our missiles, have a circuit and communications capabilities that no one can touch for 20 years. That was all true. It wasn't a mistake to think that way.
The second point is that the gap is closing, again, because of the investments the Chinese are making, because of their own overall level of increasing technological sophistication as an economy and as a society, because of the focus of their resources on military development. I don't think we can be as confident as we once were of maintaining the size of that gap between the overall quality of our systems and theirs.
The problem is the controls on our technology, which is actually manufactured by American private companies. We loosened those controls. And so the basis of our military superiority has been slowly transferred, sometimes by espionage and illegal means, but often just by direct sales. So that we lost our technological superiority unless we can move ahead more rapidly in the future. But we've also cut our own defense research and development budget. So we've eaten our seeds, as some military officers like to say, the very discoveries that made us have the best satellites, the best radio communications, the best encryption, the best fighter planes. It's gone.